Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about vaccine conversations that work. And I'm hoping that when you leave this webinar that you will be all set to have those conversations with whomever comes along. Just to note that Voices for Vaccines is a nonprofit organization that advocates for families from families. So we do a lot of plain language peer-to-peer work. So I always like to level set with what are we talking about when we're talking about hesitancy? And I think sometimes people hear vaccine hesitancy and they might think of those folks who are real loud on Twitter, who are completely against all vaccines. And that's not really who we're looking at. We see vaccine hesitancy as a spectrum. And so we really are looking at people who are maybe in an uncertain middle or even fully vaccine hesitant. So what that will look like will be someone who vaccinates, but maybe doesn't feel great about it or has some questions. Maybe someone who picks and chooses which vaccines they want to take. Maybe somebody who doesn't vaccinate, but also doesn't feel great about that. And then we have people who are vaccine hesitant, which means that they just really don't like vaccines. They're not into them. They don't get vaccines, but they also don't necessarily go real public with that. And they are maybe a little bit malleable on it so that we can talk to them and provide them some good information. So when we talk about providing them good information, we also have to acknowledge that people are, of course, subjected to all sorts of misinformation or information that is either misconstrued, rumors, like a game of telephone, or disinformation, which is purposely concocted incorrect information that's flooded into the live stream of our social conscience. So here we might look at the flow of misinformation really starting from a sort of echo chamber. And this graphic really represents what that echo chamber might look like. People talking to each other, facing each other, bouncing ideas off of each other, that misinformation dripping in, them accepting it, not moving away from it, fine being in the thrall of it. And so that's where some of these rumors might begin, or where concocted disinformation might stem from. The problem isn't necessarily in these echo chambers, because if it were going to stay in the echo chamber, we probably would be fine with our immunization rates, and we wouldn't really have much to worry about. And for a long time, that's where a lot of public health stayed, was that, if we don't pay much attention to this misinformation, we won't give it life. The problem, of course, is that someone standing outside that echo chamber can actually be splashed by, as it were, the misinformation. They can be alarmed by something that they overhear, that they're exposed to, that they come in contact with. And they might not know what to make of it. And it might affect how, of course, they are going to think about vaccines and whether or not they're going to accept them for their families. Ideally, though, we want to hand someone an umbrella so they're protected from it. So we do want to inoculate people whenever possible against misinformation, so that even if they hear it, it doesn't make them all wet about vaccines. Not to belabor a metaphor, of course. And so when we look at reasons for hesitancy, when we look at reasons for why people might still be vulnerable to misinformation or to concerns, through our experience and our work that we do every day at Voices for Vaccines, we've come up with sort of 4 buckets of reasons why people may become hesitant. And I will say that we consider these to their conclusions to be incorrect, but not unreasonable. And so our first bucket is the negative healthcare experience, of course. And then we have peer group influences, so the people around you and what they are influencing you to do. We all know about our media and social media bubbles, the algorithms that push information to us. And then also our historical or cultural reasons that we may inherit from our community, from our families, from our cultures. So looking at negative healthcare experiences, this is really the I don't trust public health, I don't trust providers, I don't trust healthcare. And of course, that can come from having a provider who is not very caring or, does not a very great job. But in our experiences, that doesn't necessarily have to be what happens. It doesn't have to be a provider's fault. In fact, a provider can be very good and someone can still have a negative experience. I always call childbirth the gateway to vaccine hesitancy when it comes to childhood immunizations, because a lot of times women will have disappointing or traumatic childbirth experiences. Disappointing in that, you know, a, a woman may not have wanted to have a cesarean section and she ended up having to have one. Maybe she wanted to go drug free, and then she was, you know, unable to handle the pain without a little bit of pharmaceutical help. Or, maybe she had a very difficult childbirth and it left her feeling bad. A lot of this due to buildup of what people are sort of culturally taught they're supposed to expect from childbirth, that it's supposed to be this amazing experience. And when it's not, or when it's, difficult, that really can make them distrust healthcare in general. There's also, fighting with insurance, having access issues because you're underinsured or uninsured, not able to get the correct healthcare you need because of insurance. And then, of course, a reaction to any medication can make people doubt putting anything in their bodies at all, even though, nothing is 100% guaranteed safe in this life. Peer group influences really um, have to do with people looking around them and saying, what's normal to do? What's acceptable to do? So you are much more likely to vaccinate if your family, friends, and colleagues around you are people who vaccinate than if your family, friends, and colleagues around you are people who don't vaccinate. And one recent study found that the quality of your relationship with a person and the frequency of communication with that person will make you listen to them more than the expertise, authority, or knowledge of another person. And so while Anthony Fauci may be not only handsome but very smart and giving sage information, your mother-in-law who calls you every day might be someone you end up listening to more about whether or not to be vaccinated. We also have, of course, our media or social media bubble. The Center for, oh goodness, I had this before. It's I'll just say it's CEPR analysis, and I have the link in my notes that I'll share with you, found that when they looked at intentions to get vaccinated for people under 65 years old, and they asked about COVID vaccines, people who watched Fox News were much less likely to get a COVID vaccination. And they compared this to whether or not they would get a flu vaccination, and the effect was not found in flu vaccination. And part of that just came from being bombarded with negative opinions about the COVID vaccination that didn't happen on Fox News when it came to flu vaccination. And so we know that where people get their information from, the algorithms on social media as well, can really drive certain types of sentiment about vaccines to you and sway what you think. And then lastly, cultural competency. A lot of times when cultural competency comes up, people will talk about the Tuskegee experiment, but I want us to think a little bit more broadly about this, and that it's not necessarily it's sometimes it's terrible things that have happened historically by doctors, but it's not necessarily always something so obvious. I have a book recommendation for you. if you want to read a book, I feel like anyone who works in public health or healthcare should read The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. And it's really about very good doctors with very good intentions who are unable to really work with among parents because there was such cultural miscommunication. And that I think that sometimes when we're not open to listening to cultural experiences and their view of healthcare and their view of prevention, that we can drive this cultural reason for refusing vaccination. And so it also comes down to people always want to know, what are people really afraid of? Of course, they're afraid of what's going to happen. If I get the vaccine, what will happen? And sometimes, even a friend of mine asked me, am I going to be in trouble because I got a J&J vaccine and then I got a Moderna shot? And when I asked her, what are you afraid is going to happen? She didn't know. She said, I don't know. I just don't know if I should be mixing and matching them. But sometimes people know precisely about what they're afraid of that's going to happen. Making the rounds once again, the ever fresh autism or neurological developmental differences issues that come up. And yes, they are back out again. This time Hep B is being brought in, thymerisol's back in this mix, and MMR. People are afraid of heart issues, heart problems. Fertility is again an evergreen concern that people have. It used to be HPV vaccines, and now COVID vaccines have been mixed up in those. I really believe that anytime you give a vaccine to young women, that fertility will be a concern that people will come up with. Sudden deaths is something that I will show you in a minute, is really making the rounds. And then also, like, I don't know what's going to happen. As my friend said to me, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. It's unpredictable. I don't know. So when we look at how people, we looked at reasons for becoming hesitant. We looked at the spectrum of vaccine hesitancy. We looked at what they're hesitant about. I think it's really important to pause for a minute and remember how people actually assess risk. And this is something that we really want people to think about, because most of us think, well, I vaccinate because I'm a rational person, and the evidence tells me I should vaccinate. All the studies say it's safe and this many people got it and it all makes sense. But I really want to challenge you about that, because I will say in January of 2021, people told me that when they got their first COVID vaccine, sometimes they would cry because it was such a relief, or they just felt so happy. They had a physical reaction of joy. And so really, even if we do vaccinate, sometimes we have a very emotional reason for vaccinating, that we're going to rush out there and get it because we really want to. Well, you can also have an emotional reason for pausing, waiting to vaccinate, or not vaccinating. Another thing to keep in mind is our behavioral immune system, the part of our brain that tells us when something is yucky and to avoid it. And the yuck factor can certainly play in when it comes to vaccines. Sometimes it plays in with, the ingredients feel yucky. Sometimes it plays in with, and I'll show you this later, what can happen to you is yucky. But it's just this really, ancient brain reaction that we can have to risk. And then we have trying to predict what's going to happen in the future. So if I get this, is it going to hurt me? If I don't get it, is it going to hurt me? Does making a decision make sense about this, or can I wait because I don't know how to predict? So when we look at emotions, one of the really big ways to touch people emotionally is through a story, particularly stories about harm and death. And a number of these died suddenly posts have been making their way through all methods of social media, based on a film called Died Suddenly by Stu Peters, who is a conspiracy theorist with his own YouTube Rumble show. I'm not exactly sure where he's on, but he's popular. And the idea is that these folks go online, see someone died, put their picture up and say, it was probably the vaccine. They don't have to have a lick of evidence that the person actually ever was vaccinated, that it was connected to vaccination. They just will post over and over again, look, it's the vaccine. And you'll see here too, this William Mackis is a Canadian doctor who is no longer licensed to practice medicine. And here he has a Scottish bagpiping legend, John Eliot, died. And you'll see he doesn't say, and the vaccine killed him. He says, in the post-COVID-19 vaccine era, men are routinely dying in their 40s. It's the new normal. So the intimation is there, but it's not necessarily stated directly, but it's enough. It's enough to scare somebody. And also, I just want to point out the Canadian Polly hashtag and the AB leg hashtag have been so co-opted by him. They stand for Canadian politics and Alberta legislature. They've been so co-opted by him that they are now basically anti-vaccine hashtags. So that's how popular and how far-reaching these emotional stories are that can really scare a person away from vaccinating. The yuck factor, I decided not to actually show you these because they really are gross. But the yuck factor really makes vaccines as disgusting as possible. In the old days, in the pre-COVID times, this really was about vaccine ingredients, of course, fetal cells are in your vaccines, aborted fetal cells. But now they've come up with a new way of trying to gross people out, and that is by claiming that embalmers are finding really big, gross clots in the bodies of people they are embalming. The problem, of course, is that embalmers have no medical background, and that, when you've got a body that's maybe been stored for a while, it wouldn't be unusual to find a blood clot. And none of these people have access to know anyone's vaccination status. So the idea is that embalmers are finding clots. Clearly, this is the COVID vaccine. Isn't that gross? And really is very effective at scaring people away. This is also part of the Died Suddenly movie by Stu Peters. And then there's predictions. So a lot of times people will say, well, this vaccine, what do we really know about it? HPV vaccine was the victim of this for quite a while. It still is a little bit, oh, that's a brand new vaccine. You don't know what's going to happen. What are the long-term risks? And they base this on us learning new things years later, about burn pits or PFAS or asbestos was considered so safe that they used it as fake snow in things like The Wizard of Oz. Sorry, I'm fighting my cat off. He's been not good lately. And so, they think to themselves, if these are the things that are dangerous, why would you know what's going to happen with vaccines? And that's really something that, we need to explain to people how vaccines work and why we're not afraid of long-term problems. And also we can stop calling the HPV vaccine a new vaccine. And then the last piece we need to think about when it comes to the yuck factor and the emotional factors in particular is that social media engagement is actually driven by big emotions. And so there's more engagement in posts that make people angry or sad, or, there's laughter too, which is usually, I find not as like that as actually funny, but more like, wow, I really hate you for posting that. That's what it means on our Facebook page anyway. That people are more likely to engage in those posts, and that engagement includes sharing them on social media so that they gain more ubiquity. And so if we're really making people mad about vaccines, if we're making them have these big emotional reactions, we're going to see more engagement for our personal brand. And that's when we get to my pitch to you, which is that you can't reason someone out of a position that they've been scared into. And so we need to help them sort of step away from those big emotional fears. We need to build trust so that we can help them with that rational thought process that really helps us make the best decisions for our families. And that's why we used motivational interviewing techniques to come up with what we call the 4A method. So this isn't necessarily pure motivational interviewing, but it sort of rhymes and harmonizes with it. So the 4A's are ask, acknowledge, affirm, and answer. Asking is to sort of get deeper into what their concerns are and learn more about it. So we approach them with an attitude of learning more about someone's concerns, of growing closer to them and understanding them a little bit. Acknowledging is really finding some sort of common ground. Um, and looking for that knowledge that they have. Affirming is really supporting them in their quest for answers, and then answering, of course, is providing an answer, but we also always like to add in the key getting permission before giving them an answer. So the thing with the 4A method that we really want to avoid is the lecture. I think vaccines cause me to grow a tail. Our first reaction is going to be to correct them. And we're really trying to get people to stop their first reaction, to think rationally about how to enter into the conversation, and to build that trust and get their permission to work with them on building confidence in the vaccines. So asking again gets the person talking. You want them to do some talking and you to do some listening by asking them open-ended questions, by asking questions to drill deeper into their concerns, and to ask them to pinpoint their main concern rather than telling them what their concern is. And really, part of this is to learn more so that you're not making assumptions, so that you're entering a conversation with them with an open mind instead of deciding you know what they think, but also to give them the opportunity to be heard out completely, to be understood, because it's hard to accept information from somebody who isn't trying to understand where you're coming from. Acknowledging again is partially listening for what the person is getting right. So, what can I acknowledge that will build a bridge from me to you? Um, One is that, it's I acknowledge that it's very important that you are trying to get the best information possible, that you care about your family's health. Um, I acknowledge that these pieces of information you have, yeah, you're right. Those are things that happen, or you're correct about this part, or yes, these are things that I agree with you on. Um, and then also, I know that you're going to make the best choice for your family. Part of that is letting go for us in some respect that we can't actually force anyone to make a decision, but we certainly are there to try to help them make the best decisions possible. And in all but very rare instances, that includes vaccinating their children. And then affirming is really supporting them, building trust, supporting the search that they're on. It is okay to have questions. It's okay to have questions about vaccines. It's okay to have doubts about vaccines. It's okay to think that maybe vaccines aren't that great. There's nothing morally wrong with that. Also, you're not the only one who's got these concerns. Other people do too. When I heard that, I was concerned about it too. Or, plenty of people have come to me with this concern. It's a good concern to address. I'm glad that we're here talking to this. And maybe you've already looked into this concern. So that's when you can say, yeah, like this was something I decided to look into too. Or this is a new concern to me, but I'm happy to look into it. I haven't heard of this, but I'm happy to learn more about your concern. That especially works well if you have time to come back to a person later on after you've actually done some digging. Okay, now we want to get permission before we answer their concerns. And I'll say that the permission does two things. First of all, if you say, "Can I share something with you?" and the person says yes, they're more likely to actually listen to you. If you say, "Can I share something with you?" and the person says no, then you've just saved yourself a lot of time answering somebody who's going to not listen to you. So it's good for you, it's good for them, it's good for everyone to say, I'd like to share something with you. If you can, if you can do sort of that Socratic question, that Socratic reasoning, and lead them to getting the answers themselves, or lead them to finding their own reason to vaccinate themselves, that's really a good way to go, but it can take a very long time. So a lot of times it's not possible. So we ask people to provide the information about the vaccine. And then also provide the information about how you know about that. Some people might think that means, hey, listen, I went to medical school, so I can tell you that this vaccine is safe. But really, we're talking more about how you know in the sense of how does the vaccine work. So I know that this vaccine isn't sending spike proteins into your brain because when the cells create the spike proteins, it is stuck on those cells. They're not necessarily free floating around the body, and they're pretty wimpy little spike proteins, and they are dispensed with quickly. So I'm not concerned about the vaccine sending spike proteins into your brain. If necessary, if they come up with something brand new for you, offer to do some searching on it and get back to them. But remember that answering is your last step, that we need to build trust before they will necessarily listen to our answers. That comes from listening to them. That comes from acknowledging what they're doing right. That comes from affirming their quest and affirming that it's good to have questions. So what's happening in Massachusetts right now? That we pulled this from our social listening um, software last Friday. And these are the trending topics when it comes to vaccines in Massachusetts in particular. And so you'll see, a lot of words. Some of these seem maybe what you might say a little cuckoo bananas. Um, like the assassination of John F. Kennedy. How is that related? Um, the word conspiracy is just right there. I'm not sure, if you have a favorite word, let me know in here. But you'll notice that, of course, the number one thing is COVID-19 vaccines. Still what people are most afraid of, except everywhere except maybe uh, Iowa, where they're really concerned about HPV vaccines right now. But the other thing I just want you to see is if you can notice the Alberta legislator, A.B. Legg, uh, hashtag and the Canadian Politics CDN Pulley hashtag, that those are also trending in Massachusetts, which means all those died suddenly stories are trending in Massachusetts, which is not great. So here's some of the tweets attached to those trends. Some of the leading tweets again, this is Massachusetts specific. One, of course, is a lawsuit has been filed against the state of Massachusetts for publishing fraudulent COVID mortality certificates and rigged death certificates for profit. I'm assuming you know more than I do about that, but that seems like a really big deal and something that will have to be dealt with. That maybe, the assumption here is that COVID isn't as deadly as people said it was, and they faked it all so that they could trick you into taking a vaccine. And then also the Florida Surgeon General's report that keeps getting pushed out that shows, they skipped all sorts of data in this, and they had very few citations so that they could say that there was an increased risk of cardio death in young men after COVID vaccine. Excuse me. Oops, sorry. All right. Um, This is a conspiracy theorist compendium. This is where we get JFK assassinations and Trump Russia, and there's uh, PFAS and chemicals in the water turning everyone gay, instead of, causing the cancers it's causing. HARP, 9/11, everything sort of mixed up into one. And of course, COVID vaccines are linked right in there. And so this is part of what I call always declare victory. So always say, see, we were right. Even if you have no evidence to go go with that, declaring your victory and telling people how right you were really has the effect of helping people believe that you're right. You know, you seem very confident about that. I think I'll believe you, especially if I'm in a peer group wash and a media wash and a social media wash where this is mostly what I see. It feels like this could be correct. All right, and then there's some cognitive biases. So if your favorite former president was the person behind Operation Warp Speed, and you don't trust the vaccine, how are you going to marry those two together? Well, you say that your favorite former president was deceived. He was led into believing that this not vaccine was a real vaccine, and that he was tricked, and it's terrible, and they did that to him. Um, and that's how you bring all those cognitive biases together. You know, you think that you're going to uh, take somebody who is like the Epoch Times or DC Drano in the slide before and show them how one conspiracy can't be true and that it'll make all of them fall, but in fact it'll just help them uh, switch trains to a new reason why their conspiracy is still true. And here we have that we tricked Donald Trump with things, even though he has more access to any information than any of us do. All right, so remember that lady getting splashed and being scared by it. Um, when we have all of those tweets put together, what they're hearing is that, you know, who are you actually going to trust, right? Like, you're going to trust, you know, those guys or those of us who have more of your time and attention, you know, and are closer to you, maybe. Um, do you see that scary things are happening? We're showing you again and again and again. My whole Twitter feed is just all these scary things happening. Or, you know, maybe these things are bad. Maybe you should just do nothing. Choose not to do nothing. Choose not to do anything. From us, unfortunately, a lot of what they hear is that's a conspiracy theory. You're cuckoo bananas. In fact, I think I already used the term cuckoo bananas. But this is a little beyond the pale. I can't believe you think this. It's not worth believing that. It seems very foolish. Those stories are lies. They're liars. They're lying liars who lie. So it's all a lie. And doing nothing is dangerous too. So I propose to you that what they're hearing from us, and when I say us, I mean generally, you know, a science-based community at large, certainly not their individual providers or individual organizations, but sort of this large amorphous pro-vaccine community. They're really hearing things that make them feel condescended to, you know, make them feel like they're trying to be told that they're foolish or not smart or all of these things. And at best, it may send them into a paralysis of not knowing what to do. So what we need to have them here instead is that we are people who are willing to work for their respect. We're not going to automatically think, I'm a person with this education, with these experiences, with this knowledge, so you're going to respect me, because we know that that doesn't work, that they are going to respect the people who have their time and attention. That we're people who have compassion for their concerns, that we aren't going to belittle their concerns, that we have respect for them making their own best decisions about vaccines, and that we do see them as competent for making their healthcare choices, even if we disagree with them. And we can let them know we do disagree with you. I disagree with your decision, but I respect that it's yours to make. So I want to take you through a little bit of what this looks like in sort of practice. This is very brief. It is going to sound more like a lecture than it would a conversation because I'm one person. I can't talk to myself very much. And also, I don't want to take too much time doing this. But I decided to take a real concern that people really have that is not easy to address, and that I'm sure that you've encountered before. And so this is the concern about, of course, heart issues dealing with mRNA COVID vaccines. And what that is being conflated into, as you've seen, is that there's a risk of cardiac death. Instead of just a risk of myocarditis or pericarditis, it's really being seen as cardiac death, that my child's going to have a heart attack. And so maybe a parent comes in and says, my son is a young man, and I'm concerned that if he gets this vaccine, he's at risk for cardiac death, right? They're probably not saying it to you that bluntly, but in the interest of time, this mother is very straightforward. She wants to tell you. So it's our turn to ask. Approach her with curiosity. So, we could look at her and say, oh, yeah, don't worry about that. The risk is very small. But instead, we really want to have her get that sense that we absolutely want to know more about, is this cardiac issue her only concern? Are there bigger concerns? Is this part of something larger that we need to tackle? What is it that really about cardiac problems that what does that mean to her? What is her understanding of that? And then, a question I like is if you felt reassured that there would be no problem. Now, I can't guarantee you there's never going to be no problem because I can't make any guarantees about health ever. But if you could be reassured, would you get this vaccine for him? Kind of gives you a sense of whether this is an ideological identity-based concern or whether this is a health concern. And also, can you tell me what you understand about cardiac symptoms in this vaccine? Like, walk me through what you understand. This will really help you acknowledge what they're getting right, and help you guide them toward understanding what the true risks are. With keeping in mind, of course, that risks are made at an emotional level, or risk assessment is made at an emotional level. Okay, then we're going to acknowledge, of course, she got something right. Yeah, there are cardiac concerns. There's a slightly elevated risk of myocarditis and pericarditis, or swelling in and around the heart. And as a young man, your son is in the group of people of this slightly elevated risk. It's good that you brought up this concern. I really want to talk to you about this. I think that acknowledging, and you'll see, like, there's a little correction in there too. Like, we're not talking about cardiac death. We're talking about myocarditis and pericarditis. So we're kind of helping her reframe that a little bit. A lot of people have this concern. We're affirming that this isn't cuckoo bananas to think about this. When the data first came out, a number of scientists were concerned and they looked into the issue. And it's completely normal to hear stories and worry that your son could have one of these issues. It is completely normal. I know I've talked to all sorts of parents who are completely on board with vaccination and they get there with their kids and then one of the stories enters their heads and they're like, "What? Why am I worrying about this?" Because those stories have amazing sticking power. And so it is very normal to hear a story and worry about it. Okay, so in motivational interviewing, there's the ask, offer, ask. And so it's important that you ask if it would be okay to share your perspective on the risk. To ask if they want to discuss some scientific rationale for offering this vaccine to young men, like why ACIP didn't retract that recommendation, or can I tell you what I found out when I looked into this, and to really get their permission. And then offer them an answer. These are just some answers that I very quickly typed out. But I think it's important, here we're talking about a little bit about that mRNA vaccines do carry a small risk of myocarditis, but that often resolves on its own relatively quickly. And that we have studies that show that the risk of myocarditis from COVID far outweigh the risks from the vaccines. So really, like, trying to bring that risk assessment back into balance. If their children have already had COVID and they didn't get myocarditis, I mean, that should tell them something. We found that in a very small percentage of young men, the vaccine can spur an immune reaction that causes this inflammation. The virus is much more efficient at causing this reaction. So that's a little bit about how I know what I know, that, there's an immune reaction that causes this. Again, some people are very afraid of the spike protein. So it's not the spike protein itself going and, bonking into the heart and making the heart explode. And then, in the ask, offer, ask, there's also, if you have time, a way to re-engage and elicit some responses from them. What do you think about the risk of myocarditis in the vaccine versus the virus? What I think that's a great launching off point to sort of see where they're at, to get them thinking about that, to help them reach the conclusion that vaccinating is a good idea. Do you have any thoughts about the vaccine with this information? Is just more general? And then, of course, like, do you have any more questions? We certainly, if we have the time to answer any more questions, we don't want anyone leaving us with questions on the table, because those will fester and they will go to social media and Google to find the answers that they want to find. Okay, so I started off showing you the spectrum of vaccine hesitancy, and all the way on the left, there were anti-vaxxers, people who it's part of their identity to refuse vaccines, that they really have built it so much into their core selves that there probably is no moving them. I will say, I want to just pause here and say that Voices for Vaccines works with a number of former anti-vaccine parents, and a few of them, in fact, I would say most of them, they had the same pediatricians working with their children for years. And the pediatricians were dogged and would bring everything up over and over again and would ask if they have any questions. And that's what worked, is building that relationship over time. Usually, a health concern would happen and the parent would think, why do I trust my pediatrician with this and not that? And the pediatrician had been so good and open with them that they did change their minds. That actually does work. And so sometimes it's worth keeping those people around, even if you think there's no helping them. Sometimes it's not. If you are working with a very vulnerable population, you can't risk measles coming near the rest of your population. But if you are willing to keep that person around, we recommend the pull, push, pull. So on a personal level, pull them into a trusting relationship with you. Hey, listen, I like you. I respect the way that you advocate for your family. I think that's great. And then you push away the ideas that are incorrect about vaccines. And I'll say at this point, you're probably pushing away, honestly, some conspiracy theories, some things that they just really are not going to let go of, some evidence-resistant beliefs. You say, I disagree with you about your thoughts about this vaccine. The evidence isn't there for me. I don't think we're ever going to come to an agreement on that. And I'd like to keep talking about it. But in the meantime, we've got other work to do. So let's get to work on whatever health issue you're working on now. And that really, helps make sure that that person is not further radicalized into the anti-vaccine movement, that they still have some space in your orbit, and that you're giving them the time and the respect that they need to reconsider their positions. We also want to touch on setting really reasonable goals. I think a lot of people think that changing a person's mind is of the essence. And in a sense, it really is. You don't want a kid getting sick, especially when it comes to something like a COVID vaccine. Like, COVID's out there right now. Let's get your kid a vaccine right now, please. Or if it's an older person, get a vaccine right now, please. But that's not always possible. And so we really want to set sometimes our sights based on the person on reasonable goals. So maybe your goal is to get them to agree to listen to your reasoning. Maybe your goal is to get them to agree to um, read something you're going to send them. But in any way, you are going to be a trusted person they can go to who will provide them information without judgment, who will help them get the access they want about vaccines, and who will support them through their journey to vaccine confidence, hopefully sooner rather than later. I think that it's important to set reasonable expectations for yourselves because, and I know this is Philadelphia, not Boston, by the way, but because you're going to burn out if you don't. And so you really have to set those small benchmarks and celebrate the successes that you do have and really stay positive. And with that, I think I'm ready for some questions.
Thank you so much, Karen. That was a tremendous presentation, and there's a lot to think there, and there's just really a lot to think about, I should say, and also some great ideas that I think are really going to help the folks that are on the webinar today. And at this time, we'll take some questions. If folks want to go ahead and submit those questions in the Q&A box, we'll do that. I'll also remind you that we do have some links in the chat box, links to the materials page, our events page, and also my email address for follow-up questions. So with the first question here, someone wrote, can you share an example of an interaction that you have had that started out negatively and ended up positively, i.e. a person committed to getting vaccinated? And what do you think the game changer was for this interaction?
Right. We had, I will say this is an online interaction. Not so I'm not betraying my in-person confidences. But we had a person that I would call an anti-vaccine troll on our page for a number of years. Just came, said mean, awful stuff, said vaccines are terrible, blah 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 blah. And one day someone told me, so and so, I'll call her Frederica because that's my favorite female name. Frederica is thinking about changing her mind. And I think I actually swore. And then I said, I will believe it when I talk to her. I said, ask her for her phone number. And I called her and we talked for about an hour. And what she shared with me is that when she had her babies, she was depressed, she was lonely, and the anti-vaxxers took her in. And then she saw that they were saying that the Tdap vaccine can shed, and she said, I don't think it can. And then everyone got mad at her. And so that was the moment. It was actually nothing that we actually did other than just like, apparently she picked up a piece of information from us about Tdap vaccines that really made it impossible for her to keep believing the things that they were saying. So she started looking into everything they were saying, and it just started falling apart. And what finally made it happen is that it was us and then a few of our volunteers who really supported her through the rest of this, which was, hey, yeah, I'll talk to you. What questions do you have? What are you concerned about? And her kids are fully vaccinated now, and she lives a happy private life, and is happily married and has beautiful vaccinated children. So I'm very happy with that one. That one was a few years ago. Our most and you can find a lot of our anti-vax to pro-vax stories, but another one was actually a mother who read one of our blog posts called "Growing Up Unvaccinated," written by an adult woman whose mother hadn't vaccinated her, and she got every single vaccine preventable disease and was absolutely miserable growing up. And so that really made her reconsider her thoughts Um, so that's, yeah, that's sort of what worked for us.
Thank you, Karen. And the next question is, there are two that are very similar. I'll read them both together. One is, why do they need the vaccines? So how do you respond when parents say, why do we need the vaccine if people have already had COVID? I heard natural immunity is supposed to be better. And similarly, any specific advice you can give? A lot of the responses to COVID specific vaccines are, I've had enough boosters already, or I've lived this long without it. Why do I need it now?
Right. I mean, there's there's a lot of magical thinking that happens around viruses. Um, people can't see viruses, obviously, and sometimes they feel like they can that they're powerful enough that they can outpower the viruses. And when we ask them to get vaccines, it's a way of asking them to cede their power about that, particularly older folks who might feel like, I've been around for a long time. I've been living my life for a long time. Now you want me to change it? I think I know what I'm doing. And I think part of that is really explaining to people how vaccines do build natural immunity. That, obviously you don't get COVID one time and then you're done with it forever. That you can get COVID many times. I know one woman who got COVID twice in 2 months. So it's a very sneaky virus. Um, but the vaccines work with your natural immune system, that this is your body powering itself to protect you against COVID, to protect you against any untoward side effects. I think before you get there, of course, we always approach them with curiosity. We ask, affirm, acknowledge, and then answer. But really explaining to people, I don't want you to seed the ground that natural immunity is a thing, because it really isn't. Natural immunity just means getting sick. Our immune systems are natural. The way vaccines work with them is natural. And your natural immune system is very happy to have the vaccine to battle instead of the full on virus.
Thank you, Karen. Another question here. What is your opinion on practices dismissing patients who refuse all vaccines?
So I have a number of feelings about that. I'll say, first of all, that I don't run a practice, so I feel like my opinions are my opinions and not necessarily the last word on it. I think it's a good conversation for people to have. I think within a practice, it's a good conversation for the entire practice to have, to really talk it through, including, the people that maybe aren't usually decision makers. The people who run the business office, the people who have contact with patients at the front desk first, to really see where people are with this, because their ability to withstand risk of unvaccinated people might be a lot lower than yours. And so I think really hearing them out is important. Um, I take my children to a pediatrician who accepts unvaccinated patients. And I tell people that and they're surprised. But I will tell you, there's a few reasons for it. Right now, the risk to my children is very low. They're fully vaccinated. Um, it, you know, I might change that if my children had to go through, say, chemotherapy or something. I might decide to go to a different pediatric office. But right now, I'm comfortable there. I also, though, as part of a public health measure, I would rather have each office having a very small number of unvaccinated patients than a whole bunch of unvaccinated patients congregating in one office. And we do, in my home state, have a pediatric clinic that caters to unvaccinated children, and they have 8 locations. I don't like that. And so I would rather that a pediatrician that I feel comfortable with, who I know is giving them sound medical advice. I'll say that anti-vaccine pediatric office, I've also seen them recommend garlic drops for ear infections. So I'd rather have a pediatrician who's going to prescribe amoxicillin, or tell them to wait it out, than than, giving bad advice. And again, like sprinkling unvaccinated people through a community instead of congregating them all into one space is, just as far as public health, a better way of doing that. The other issue is really if your patients aren't taking your recommendations, then how much do you really want to work with them? And I think that there is a frustration level that only an individual provider can really answer about that. But I'm hoping that by helping providers see small successes as important, that they will gain some resilience on that. And I hate saying that because I know that resilience is something that we're all in very short supply of after the pandemic. But I'm here to believe in you.
Thank you, Karen. Another COVID-related question. In some instances, is if it's just political, not fear or questioning, is there anything different in terms of strategies to address those concerns or barriers?
Right. I don't think the strategy necessarily differs much at all as far as really building a relationship with somebody and earning their trust, working toward earning their trust, providing them respect for where they've landed. Um, and then going forth with that. I think that one of the things that we might need to do is steel ourselves for some beliefs that maybe we find repugnant. Um, that all sorts of things can get mushed into this vaccine space, and that we just really want to clear the way and be like, hey, let's just talk about the vaccine right now. What are you worried is going to happen with this vaccine? Uh, I think the one thing for people who've built an identity around being angry about vaccines is that in some cases they feel like they have been belittled. They feel like they have lost power, especially through the pandemic. Maybe they were unable to work during lockdowns, or maybe they felt like they were being forced into getting a vaccine, or maybe they just felt like, people were being smug and elitist about thinking they knew so much about vaccines. That's the other side of that identity thing is, hey, you boxed me into this corner and now I'm here and now you want to tell me I'm wrong. Um, and I think we really need to listen and hear if that's some of what's going on, but also really, you know, convey to them, hey, I know you're good at taking care of your family. I respect how much you don't want to just, take my word for it and you want to look at things yourself. I'd love to help you look at that. Can we build this relationship and do this together? And I think that's really important. But also respecting that at the end of the day, whether or not the vaccine goes into their arms or their family's arms is their choice. Um, and it might be the incorrect choice, but we do live in a free country, for all the good and the bad that comes along with that.
Thank you, Karen. That's it for questions. And I want to again thank you so much for this incredible presentation. I think there's so much to learn from it, and definitely some great strategies and tactics. If folks have any follow-up, they can feel free to email me. My email address is in the chat box. I also have links there for the events page and the materials page. So you'll find recordings of this webinar and the other sessions at the events page and the slides on the materials page. And I thank you once again. I hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks a lot, Ted.